Welcome to CCBS NeuroTalk. Shalom today. I'm today's moderator, Chenggang Wu. I'm working at Shanghai International Studies University. And NeuroTalk Shalom is organized by the students of the Center of Cognitive and Brain Sciences at the University of Macau. And we are aiming at enhancing the academic sharing, networking, and development among CCBS and beyond. Today, we are very glad and have a great opportunity to have the Shalom, and we are very pleased to have Dr. Xiaochen Zhang to share his recent research work. We also have maybe almost 40 participants online, and we are very grateful for your kind coming. And before Dr. Zhang give us his excellent presentation, let me give you a brief introduction about himself. Dr. Xiaochen Zhang obtained his PhD degree in biomedical engineering at Tsinghua University, Beijing in 2019. And he is currently an assistant research fellow at the lab of PHI, Shanghai Mental Health Center, Shanghai Jiao Tong University School of Medicine. And his research interest includes auditory and visual processing and their interplay with emotional and cognitive processes among healthy and humans with mental disorders. And his talk today is about plastic subcortical sound encoding underlying music pitch perception. And let us give our warm and loud applause for his excellent presentation. Okay, Dr. Zhang, it's your turn.
Thank you, Chenggang, and thank everyone here for attendance. Let me share my screen. Thank you. I'm very glad to be invited, and I'm very glad to have a chance to present I don't think it's recent, but some of my work here. And this work is part of my PhD project, which is about subcortical sound encoding and pitch perception. So I guess this is a very important piece of the project, and it's about music pitch perception. We know that in daily lives, people are very different in music perception. Some people have an excellent music aptitude, so that they may learn to practice music very quickly. Others, including me, actually are not very good at things like discrimination of various music notes, and may not be good at getting a new skill that is related to music. I have been wondering for a long time why this is the case. So that's one of the motivations of my PhD project. Basically, I focus on pitch, which is a key element of music perception, and I'm trying to answer these questions listed here. What are the neural mechanisms underlying music pitch perception, and what neural correlates to music perception can account for the individual differences. First, I'd like to share some background information about the terminology. The first is pitch. Pitch is what people perceive a sound as its height. I think the pitch is closely related to the repetition rate of sound waves, like here. If we perform a Fourier transform, we could get a spectrum of the sound. And in this case, we can see a clear harmonic structure, which is also a common phenomenon. And the first harmonic is termed as the fundamental frequency, and it is the most correlated component of the sound to pitch. And next, I'd like to have a very brief review of the sound processing along the auditory pathway. Previous studies found pitch selective neurons in the auditory cortex among non-human primates, and also a corresponding pitch-related area in human auditory cortex. But its relation with the individual differences in pitch perception has not been clearly revealed yet. In this study, we focus on the auditory brainstem, or in other words, subcortical auditory nuclei. I think they refers to the same thing. The auditory brainstem is possibly plays the similar roles as V1 in the visual system. So its functional roles may include extraction of simple features, but in the auditory modality. So that conceivably includes pitch. A key characteristic of sound encoding at the subcortical level is phase locking. Phase locking refers to the phenomena that the neural response is synchronized to the temporal wave or the temporal amplitude envelope of upcoming sounds. And phase locking is considered as the primary fundament of pitch encoding at the low frequency range. Next, I'd like to talk about a steady state component of the auditory event related potential named frequency following response. This technique could be used to record non-invasively in humans the subcortical encoding of sounds. So basically, the FFR represents the temporal encoding of sounds, which is phase locking throughout the auditory system, thanks to some recent studies. So the updated knowledge of the FFR is that it also represents the temporal encoding of sounds in the auditory cortex. Therefore, we need to put some constraints to the experimental paradigm so that we could ensure that the FFR recorded here represent only subcortical sound encoding. These constraints include first, using stimuli with a higher fundamental frequency, which means it should be over 200 hertz. And the second point is to use the EEG technique over the MEG technique. There are several conventional indices of the FFR that includes temporal and spectral amplitude. The amplitude represents clearly the strength of the neural activity underlying the subcortical encoding of sounds. And we also computed the stability of response via intertrial phase locking, which we will revisit later. And in this study, we also computed tracking, not accuracy, but error, but that's equivalent. But they are equivalent. But I don't want to focus on this index because there is no significant effects found here. Okay, that's the end of the review of terminology. I'd like to start let's go back to the research question here. So that is what neurocorrelates relates to music pitch perception. First, I'd like to have an introduction of the conventional view on this question, and I called it as the enhanced encoding hypothesis, because this hypothesis suggests that better pitch perception is associated with the stronger and or more robust subcortical encoding of sounds. For example, in this picture, musicians have clearly a stronger and more robust subcortical encoding of sounds than non-musicians, and there are actually some group comparisons and brain behavior correlations across individuals supporting this hypothesis. However, there are some confounding factors that may be neglected, such as the musicianship or linguistic background of subjects, and as well as the long-term or short-term experiences that may simultaneously improve behavioral pitch discrimination performances and subcortical sound encoding. Also, importantly, there are some mixed results reported previously. Musicians sometimes fail to show more robust subcortical encoding of sounds than non-musicians, and also this is a critical piece of evidence suggesting that subcortical encoding of pitch does not seem to be deficient among people with deficient pitch perception, like those with amusia, which means they cannot, they are not very good at appreciating music. Based on these informations, we proposed an alternative view that I called as the plastic encoding hypothesis. We believe that superior pitch perception for music melodies may be associated with the flexibility of dynamic context-dependent encoding of sounds. And this is demonstrated by the differential encoding of physically identical sounds presented in various contexts. Importantly, this context-dependent plasticity of subcortical sound encoding is reported to be functionally associated with performances in various dimensions of auditory perception in previous studies, like the one presented here. It is correlated with speech in noise perception among school-age children and among musicians. It is also correlated with a reading performance among school-age children, and also with rapid learning of statistical characteristic of the current sound stream. So these findings suggest possible brain behavior connections between the context-dependent plasticity at the subcortical level, of course, and auditory perceptual capabilities, including music pitch perception. Therefore, our research question could be specified as how exactly is the behavioral pitch perception for music melodies, particularly associated with subcortical sound encoding. And here's the two hypotheses to be examined. As could be seen, we need a neurophysiological measure that could help us disambiguate these two hypotheses. we focus on the intertrial phase locking, which abbreviated as ITPL here. It refers to how synchronized the neural responses to the same stimulus across multiple trials. And importantly, it is conventionally used to represent the stability or consistency of sound encoding. However, we believe that the stability of sound encoding is just an interpretation of the ITPL. The mathematical definition of the ITPL also allows it to be interpreted as the variability of sound encoding. After all, more stable encoding across trials is semantically equivalent to less variable encoding across trials and vice versa. Hence, subjects with stronger and more robust encoding should show larger strength and larger ITPL. In contrast, subjects with more variable encoding should show weaker ITPL. In this study, we recorded FFRs in a context comprising randomly presented musical sounds. And this random context clearly could be regarded as composed of micro contexts that had a shorter duration, but also comprised randomly presented musical sounds. Therefore, these micro contexts are not essentially different from the whole random context. Since the ITPL represents the FFR variability across the trials that are clearly embedded in different micro contexts, we argued that the ITPL here could pick up the variability across micro contexts and thus could measure the context-dependent variation of FFRs across trials, which means the context-dependent plasticity. Therefore, the ITPL, together with the spectral strength, provides a good chance for us to disambiguate the enhanced encoding hypothesis and the plastic encoding hypothesis underlying music pitch perception. And next, I listed detailed predictions for each hypothesis. If the plastic encoding hypothesis is correct, we would observe negative correlations between pitch discrimination performance and ITPL, because if the pitch discrimination is high, and it means better behavior, and the ITPL is low, that refers to better or greater plasticity. So there will be negative correlations. In contrast, if the enhanced encoding hypothesis is correct, we would observe positive correlations between behavioral performance and FFR spectral strength, as well as positive correlations between behavioral performance and the ITPL. Because in this study, we are the first to use the ITPL to represent the plasticity. Therefore, we believe that it is our responsibility to provide some supporting evidence that the ITPL indeed represents the plasticity. Therefore, we explicitly established a different context and compare the FFRs in response to physically identical musical sounds presented in the two contexts via a plasticity index. We introduced here directly quantifying the context-dependent variation of FFRs between the contexts. And our predictions are of course, assuming the plastic encoding hypothesis is correct, are that we would observe negative correlations between the ITPL and the plasticity index, as well as positive correlations between the plasticity index and behavioral performance in the music pitch discrimination task. Next, let's move on to see the paradigm of this study. In this study, we used the vowel in Chinese Mandarin at 5 fundamental frequencies that corresponds to 5 music notes on the music scale. They are do, re, mi, fa, sol. And first, we arrange these 5 music notes into a particular order that forms the refrain part of a familiar melody, Jingle Bells, according to this score. And here displays the spectrogram of a complete refrain part of Jingle Bells here. And in the familiar melody context, the refrain part of Jingle Bells with a duration of 19.2 seconds was repetitively presented. And then in order to produce the random context, we randomized the presentation order of all the musical sounds, and we obtained the random note context. Here displays the spectrogram of an illustrative segment of the sound stream in the random note context. And so these squares are actually musical sounds. The onset of each music sound is considered as an event, and based on these events, we conducted event-related analysis of the EEG signals. And let's see the spectral characteristics of the neural response to the musical sounds. It could be observed that both ITPL, here's ITPL, and the spectral strength show a spectral peak at the frequency corresponding to the fundamental frequency of the stimulus for each of the 6 conditions with a relatively high signal to noise ratio. Here's noise. These results suggest faithful and successful encoding of sound pitch. And also we could observe here that the stimulus fundamental frequency significantly affected both FFR measures. The ITPL increased and the spectral strength decreased as the stimulus fundamental frequency increased. However, we did not observe any significant difference between the 2 contexts in either FFR measure. Therefore, we quantified the context-dependent plasticity directly via the FFR temporal wave morphology. Let's revisit it later. And next, I'd like to give a brief introduction of the behavioral task I used. It's an off the rack test that we could buy on Amazon, and it is named Advanced Measures of Music Audiation. It contains 30 questions, and each of them is actually a music melody discrimination task. Subjects will hear 2 music excerpts, and they should immediately respond whether these 2 music melodies are the same or different in pitch or different in rhythm, and subjects are allowed to give up and not answer, but they are not allowed to guess. Let's hear an example question here.
First. Second.
This is a relatively difficult question, and the answer to this question is that the two music melodies are different in pitch, and with these 30 questions, we will finally obtain a pitch discrimination score and a rhythm discrimination score, and the raw scores were transformed into the percentile ranks among university students of non-music majors according to the normative data. And all the subjects included in this study are university students of non-music majors that were recruited in Beijing. Okay, let's move on to the results. And here's a frame of the data analysis in this study. They're basically just correlations between behavioral and neural measures. We focused on FFR spectral strength, FFR ITPO, and the plasticity index. And first, we investigated the correlations between music pitch discrimination and FFR spectral strength. We did not observe any significant correlation between these two measures for any condition. And this is actually consistent with some previous studies, especially those include subjects that speak a tonal language like Chinese Mandarin. And next, we investigated the correlation between music pitch discrimination and the FFR ITPL. We observed negative correlations between these two measures for almost all the conditions. And what's more, if we regress out the spectral strength from the ITPL, the negative correlations between the ITPL and the behavioral pitch discrimination score became much stronger for all the 6 conditions. Therefore, these results suggesting the context-dependent plasticity underlying the pitch perception for music melodies, and it is in favor of the plastic encoding hypothesis. Hence, here we got the negative correlations. And then we examined whether the FFR ITPL indeed represents the context-dependent plasticity, and if the context-dependent plasticity indeed positively correlate with music pitch discrimination. We quantified the context-dependent plasticity by the proportion of data variance and or information that was not shared by the FFRs in response to physically identical music sounds between the two contexts. Therefore, it primarily represents the context-dependent dissimilarity in the FFR temporal wave morphology. Here we could see that the plasticity indices, because it's calculated via 2 approaches. One is data variance and the other is data information. The 2 plasticity indices are both strongly negatively correlated with the ITPL. Yes, the horizontal axis is, means ITPL for all the conditions. Here just display the results for one of the musical notes. Hence, we got negative correlations here. That means the ITPL indeed represents the plasticity, at least here. And then we examined whether the plasticity indices are correlated with the behavioral performance, and we observed significant positive correlations between the plasticity indices and the pitch discrimination score for all the three stimulus fundamental frequencies. And this picture gives a direct impression of the context-dependent plasticity. Let's see. Here for subject 5, the FFR in response to the same stimulus fluctuated across the time in nearly the same pattern. For subject 8, the two FFRs varied to a slightly greater extent. And for subject 9, the two FFRs, although they are in response to physically identical sounds, seem to be very different. These three subjects consistently showed decreasing ITPL, increasing in plasticity index, and increasing sensitivity to music pitch. Therefore, these results together suggest that first, the ITPL, at least that in the random context, indeed represents the context-dependent encoding of music sounds at the subcortical level. And this plasticity was indeed positively correlated with music pitch perception. So here we got positive correlations. And the next question here, we'd like to further explore the specificity of the, okay, sorry, I missed the thing. We revisited the correlations between the FFR spectral strength and the music pitch discrimination. Let's recall our previous results is that they are not correlated. But when we controlled the ITPL using the partial correlation, the spectral strength was significantly positively correlated with music pitch discrimination score for the higher two of the three stimulus fundamental frequencies in either context. Therefore, we got they are positively correlated, but only if the ITPL is controlled and it's and this effect is frequency dependent. And also, these two measures are theoretically positively correlated. And if we use the partial correlation to control the spectral strength, the negative correlations between the ITPL and the behavioral discrimination score were still there. Therefore, these results suggest that these two measures are independently associated with music pitch perception. And also these results suggest that the plastic encoding hypothesis and the enhanced encoding hypothesis are both partially correct. And next, we'd like to explore the specificity of the correlation of these neural measures to music pitch discrimination. Here we only got another behavioral performance is music rhythm discrimination. And we found that these three neural measures are more correlated with music pitch discrimination than with rhythm discrimination. Therefore, we believe that they are probably specifically correlated to pitch processing for music perception. And then I'd like to discuss two points. And the first point is raised by a reviewer, by a reviewer of the manuscript. I think it is a very good point. This reviewer says that as the phase locking at higher level structures, which means the auditory cortex, is weaker than lower level structures, it is possible that those who are more sensitive to music pitch have more plastic sound encoding because their FFRs rely more on the contributions of the auditory cortex. This is a reasonable statement. Therefore, we conducted a source reconstruction analysis for the frequency following responses here, and the estimated source distribution were not significantly different between the two groups with different sensitivity to music pitch, nor were the FFR scalp distributions. The two groups were divided according to the median of the behavioral pitch score. And furthermore, for either group, the estimated source distributions were restricted to the subcortical region, and no activation at the right or the left auditory cortex was observed. Therefore, these findings suggest that first, the FFRs recorded here indeed arise from the auditory brainstem, and second, the context-dependent plasticity reported here may not be attributed to the individual differences in the contributions of the auditory cortex to the FFRs. And the second point I'd like to discuss here is the context-dependent plasticity may be a general characteristic of multiple subcortical auditory nuclei. Our previous study displayed here, demonstrated stimulus fundamental frequency specific configurations of neurogenerators underlying the FFR, with higher level structures contributing more to the FFR in response to stimuli with a lower fundamental frequency. This study was done primarily by comparisons between FFR topographies and topographies of the auditory brainstem response evoked by clicks. Therefore, these results suggest that the significant FFR behavioral correlations observed for multiple stimulus fundamental frequencies here may suggest the context-dependent plasticity be a general characteristic of subcortical sound encoding shared by multiple nuclei. In summary, this study documents the context-dependent plasticity and the strength of subcortical sound encoding independently and perhaps specifically underlying music pitch perception. To be more specific, greater variability and greater strength in sound representations are independently associated with better performances in discrimination of pitches in music melodies. We believe that these findings expand the knowledge on the functional roles of early stage auditory processing at the subcortical level and demonstrate that the plasticity and the strength of subcortical sound encoding are already functionally connected to pitch processing for music perception. And in the end, I'd like to thank to the lab I used to stay. This work is a part of my PhD project at Tsinghua University, and here's a photo of the lab I used to stay in, and much thanks to Dr. Ting Gong, who is my PhD supervisor, and all the lab members here. They support me to a great extent. And also, I'd like to give an advertisement for the current for the lab I'm currently at, and the entire name is the Psychological Health and Imaging Group, which is abbreviated as PHI. And our group focuses on brain developments in children and adolescents with mental disorders, as well as cross-disease psychiatric neuroimaging. Therefore, in my future studies, I'd like to investigate possible abnormalities in the subcortical sound encoding among children and adolescents with mental disorders. And here's the link to the website of our group, and you can find more information there. Thank you very much. That's the end of my talk.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Jiang, for his excellent and remarkable presentation about his work during his PhD study. And I'm very impressed by his very detailed information about two hypotheses. And I'm very impressed by his very insightful view about the alternative hypothesis that has not been investigated. I think it is very great theoretical contribution to this field. And so next part is the QA part. So any questions or comments to his presentation? The audience, are you there?
Thank you, Dr. Zhang. I might have two small questions. So can you go back to a slide right before the correlational results?
This one?
Yep. So it seems that you focused on the correlational results.
Yes.
In your results analysis. I'm wondering how is behavior results from this task MMDT task?
Okay. Probably I didn't give a very detailed introduction of this test. It contains 30 questions, and to say a question, it actually in each question, subjects will hear two music melodies, and they are instructed to respond immediately after they heard the two music melodies, that whether these two melodies were the same or different in pitch or different in rhythm, and if they are allowed to skip answering, but they are told that guessing is not encouraged. If a subject correctly report the same the sameness or difference in pitch between the two music melodies, and they will earn 1 point in the pitch discrimination score. And that's the same for the rhythm discrimination score. And if they incorrectly identify something, and they will lose respective points. For example, if a pair of music melodies that are actually the same, but the subject says that they are different in pitch, so they'll lose 1 point in their pitch discrimination score. And thereby we got the raw scores of pitch discrimination and rhythm discrimination. And then we transform the raw scores into the percentile ranks among university students of non-music majors. And this normative data were given by the manuals. I hope this answers your question.
Yeah. Thank you for elaboration. So I have a question about the individual difference, but you have addressed that in the later part, which is raised by the reviewer. And thank you. And I have another question about the correlational results. So
Yeah.
it seems that you conducted a lot of correlational
Yes.
comparisons. So did you do
multiple comparisons?
Yeah.
Yes. I did FDR corrections for the multiple comparisons. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for your elaboration.
So any other questions?
Does Dr. Hu has some question?
So I have a lot of questions. Actually, the music.
Yeah.
Oh, here is the one question.
Oh, yes, I see. How did I do the pitch tracking? Okay. That's a good question. So for the stimuli used in this study, they are actually not different across time. Their fundamental frequency are not variant across the time, but we still use a short-term Fourier transform to do the pitch to do the tracking error. I think it's here. Yes, to do the compute the tracking error of the FFR. We first apply the short-term Fourier transform to the stimuli and get a pitch contour for the stimuli, and then for the FFR of each individual, we also apply the same short-term Fourier transform and get a contour for each individual FFR, and their Euclidean distance is calculated as the tracking error. But I'd like to mention here that just as the spectral strength and the ITPL, we did not observe significant difference in the tracking error between the two contexts. That's why we addressed the context-dependent plasticity directly by comparing the temporal wave morphology of the FFR. I hope this answers your question.
Can I just open the microphone and say in this way?
Sorry, I failed to hear you clearly. I beg your pardon.
I have another question. Can you hear
Yeah,
me
well,
now? Oh, okay, thank
yes.
you. I have a little question about the index you used, that the ITPL.
Yeah.
You said that it referred to how synchronized the neuron responses to the same stimulus across multiple trials. And you said that it can reflect the stability and the variability of the sound encoding. How can we understand the stability and variability? I mean that if I have the higher RTPL, does it mean the higher stability or higher variability?
I think that depends. So, therefore, here I labeled it as an ambiguous measure because mathematically it could you could interpret this this measure as the stability, but of course you can interpret it as the plasticity or flexibility or variability. That's all okay because because these words are actually just semantic labels you put on the mathematical definition of the ITPL. Therefore, it really depends on the specific situation of your paradigm or your subjects, or yeah, I think many factors should be considered. But one point I'd like to point out that here is that in this study we used a stimulation paradigm with sounds of great diversity. In previous studies that interpret the ITPL as the stability of subcortical sound encoding, they usually use the repetitive stimulation paradigm with only one sound, and it is repetitively presented with fixed intertrial intervals. In my opinion, that repetitive paradigm is explicitly designed to test the stability of the auditory system. Therefore, the flexibility of the auditory brainstem are not given any chance to be displayed. Therefore, in this study, with this stimulation paradigm that includes sounds of great diversity, we indeed observed that the ITPL could represent the plasticity, or we can say the variability or the flexibility. To summarize, the opposite of the stability. Therefore, I think in future studies we should be more careful on the interpretation of this measure. Yeah, it does not necessarily means stability nor plasticity. It depends. I hope this answers your question.
Okay, thank you very much. And can I ask the last question? How did you define the plasticity index?
Okay, this is a good question, and I indeed did not addressed earlier. Here I say that the context-dependent plasticity is defined as the proportion of data variance that was not shared by the FFRs. That means for each subject, we have two FFR signals, one for each context, and I did I calculate the rank correlational coefficient, that is Spearman's rule, and I take 1 minus rho square to realize this part, the proportion of data variance. And for the proportion of data in information, I used an index based on the information theory named mutual information. Basically, I calculated the mutual information between the two FFRs of the same subject in the two contexts, and there is a variation of the mutual information which refers to the distance between the two signals. So I use that measure to be another plasticity index here. So here I got two plasticity indices calculated with different methods, and the results are highly resembling.
Okay, thank you very much, and nice talk. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the audience?
Hello, Dr. Zhang, can you hear me?
Yes.
I firstly thank you for your presentation. I'm greatly enlightened by it. And I'm also curious about your behavioral test.
Yeah.
Like you used a stream of nodes, right? Instead of why don't you use two nodes which are different in fundamental frequency as a pair? Because I think if you use a stream of nodes, it may not only influenced by the pitch perception, but also memory.
Oh, yes. I can understand your question. Do you mean that are you asking if I also I mean, why don't I use the fundamental frequency difference threshold? Is my understanding correct?
I mean, if you use a string of nodes as the stimuli, maybe it's like I think I'm good at pitch discrimination, but maybe I'm not that good at pitch memory.
Oh, okay. I believe, of course, that's my personal opinion, that pitch memory might be a relatively complex process that may not reflected in subcortical neural activities. Therefore, the correlations found between a task that clearly involves pitch memory and subcortical sound encoding could be regarded as a I don't know how to put it out. Could be regarded as a supporting evidence that that pitch memory may be a may have an effect also on the subcortical processing. I admit that in this study, we cannot differentiate the sensory part of the of pitch discrimination and pitch memory. They are combined, and they are measured here in a combined way, and in a future study, I used a simple fundamental frequency difference task to separate the pitch discrimination and pitch memory, and I hope the results of this future work may answer your question. And according to the results presented here, I think I cannot provide a reliable and convincing answer to your question.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Thank you very much.
So I think the time is up, right? So time flies, and we are approaching to the end of this talk because it's almost over 1 hour ago. And I think Dr. Zhang has already given us a very brilliant lecture and presentation about his work. And there are so many details and information that I have a lot of questions, but I think I will call this the end of this topic and lecture today. So before we just leave out, maybe we can take a group photo, right? Before the end of this talk.
Yes.
So how can I just?
Yeah, Dr.
Okay,
Ram,
can you take a photo? I'm not
yeah,
familiar
yeah.
with.
Yeah, so everyone, may I ask you to open up your camera so we can take a group photo. Hello, Veronica, long time no see. Oh, hello, everyone. More faces? Oh, Jason. Okay. Hello, Professor Zhou. I want to introduce our special guest, Professor Zhou Weijing from Yangzhou University, and she is a linguist in phonetics. And we hope we could hear from her in the future salon sessions. Welcome, Professor Zhou. Okay, everyone, look at the camera and smile. 1, 2, 3, go. One more. 1, 2, 3, go. Thank you.
So let me give a brief end of this topic. So everybody,